Kalorama, a Recorded Books hybrid imprint, presents The Fighting Soul, On the Road with Bernie Sanders, by Ari Rabin-Havt. Read by Peter Berkrot. Prologue. Ari, get me a chair. At that moment, I knew something was very wrong. Bernie Sanders never asked to sit down during a campaign event in the more than 3 years I'd traveled with him. There are, in fact, few things he detests more than sitting down when answering people's questions. He thinks it's disrespectful. It was Tuesday, October 1st, 2019, and Bernie was speaking at a low-dollar fundraiser in a Middle Eastern restaurant a few miles from the Las Vegas Strip. At the end of his stump speech, he asked for a chair. Once seated, Bernie answered only a handful of questions from the attendees, far fewer than normal. He then left the stage, skipping the selfie line that was customary at these events. The day began with no hint of what was to come. We arrived in Las Vegas and headed to the Healing Garden, a memorial honoring the victims of the deadliest mass shooting in American history, which took place outside the Mandalay Bay Casino. I took photographs of Bernie that afternoon, as I always did. Looking back, they revealed no indication of what was to come. He was genuinely moved by the experience and was somber but friendly with those gathered at the site to mourn. Before heading to the fundraiser, we stopped at a Starbucks for a cup of coffee. Inside, Bernie and I got into an argument about the next day's schedule, which he claimed was too taxing. While it was not uncommon for Bernie to quiz me about the schedule, I should have paid more attention. We frequently argued about scheduling, but Bernie, even though he generally expressed his fatigue from having been on the road constantly for nearly 3 years, never complained about being too tired to campaign. In this case, Bernie told me he was too tired to meet with union members the next morning. Clearly, something was off. In the moment, I missed it. In the SUV leaving the fundraiser, I had no doubt something was very wrong. Bernie and I were joined in the car by Jesse Cornett, who, hours earlier, when we arrived in Las Vegas, had started working as the campaign's trip director and body man. Jesse was driving, the senator was in the front passenger seat, and I was in the back. A lead car with other staff drove ahead of us down the strip toward our hotel. "Are you okay, Senator?" I said. "Yes, just a little tired," he rumbled from the front seat. "It's been a long day." Bernie then called Jane, his wife of more than 30 years. I overheard him tell her that he was feeling a little sick and was headed to his hotel. Once the call was over, I asked, "Do you want dinner?" "No, I'll go right to my room." This was another sign that something was off. Bernie rarely turned down dinner. "Senator, would you like me to send a doctor to your hotel room?" "You can do that," he said, apparently shocked that such a service existed. "Yes, but can we talk about what's wrong so I can tell them?" Even inside a complete circle of trust, Bernie remains one of the most guarded people I've ever been around. I would often have to repeatedly prod him with questions about his well-being. "Ari, I'm just tired. I also have this pressure feeling in my lungs. It's not a pain, more like pressure." "Anything else?" "Nothing that bad. But over the past week, my left arm has hurt." I glanced to Jesse, who turned to look over his shoulder at me. That was all it took. He pulled the car out of the motorcade. As he did so, I told the senator we were going to the nearest urgent care center. I went on Google and found one just a few blocks away in a strip mall. But when we got there, the nurse inside told me they could not take any more patients for the day. Then I suddenly remembered Elite Medical, an urgent care center located behind the MGM Grand. On one of the many previous Vegas trips, I'd seen it out the window of my hotel room. I gave Jesse the address and he headed toward the facility. During the 5-minute drive, the senator's condition seemed to worsen. It was clear that he was extremely uncomfortable. His initial hesitance to seek medical treatment quickly turned to impatience, as he repeatedly asked how far we were from the clinic. When we arrived at Elite Medical, I found a nurse and told her that I had an extremely well-known patient feeling sick enough to require medical attention, asking if he could be swiftly triaged into a private room. The last thing I wanted was Bernie Sanders sitting in a busy waiting area in a Las Vegas urgent care facility. She asked who it was, and when I told her, she replied that she would need to see a driver's license. I ran out to the car and retrieved Bernie's license, and we rushed him into the clinic. Once Bernie was in the exam room, I was handed a stack of admission and insurance paperwork to fill out, and started to make a round of calls that I would repeat over and over again for the next few hours. First, Jane. Then our campaign manager, Faiz Shakir. Then Jeff Weaver, Bernie's longest-serving and closest aide, who had been with him on and off since the late 1980s. In between calls, I checked on Bernie. He was sitting up in bed, shirt off, anxious about the results of the CAT scans and other tests the doctors were performing. I feared the worst. I was the deputy campaign manager of Bernie's presidential campaign, and I couldn't help but think about what this would mean for his candidacy. But he was also a friend. We had been constant travel companions for 3 years, sharing thousands of meals and tens of thousands of miles on the road. Diving into the logistics and little details is how I prevent myself from becoming overwhelmed in challenging situations, so that's what I did. I just kept running through what needed to be done. Fill out more paperwork, check on Bernie, talk to the doctor, call Jane again, call Faiz again, call Jeff again, repeat. Eventually, a doctor told me that Bernie had a blocked artery in his heart and would need to be transported to a nearby hospital for catheterization. I dispatched staff to determine how to arrive at the hospital without making a scene. Jane and I had agreed that Bernie's children, Levi, Heather, Karina, and Dave, and grandchildren should hear about what was happening from her and not from cable news. Unfortunately, it was already after midnight in New England, where most of them lived. I didn't want someone in the hospital snapping a picture on a cell phone that would quickly make news around the world. Before the ambulance arrived to take the senator from the urgent care clinic to the hospital, the doctor told me I would need to grab Bernie's wedding ring and glasses because they could be broken or lost during the procedure. After some pushback, Bernie gave up the wedding ring, but the glasses were a different matter. "No, Ari, that's bullshit. I'm keeping them," he barked. Jesse and I spent the rest of the evening nervously passing Bernie's ring back and forth. Losing it became our greatest fear. I rode in the ambulance with Bernie, while Jesse followed in the SUV. Bernie chatted with the EMTs about the job. Did they have health insurance? How did they view health care in this country? A few minutes later, we arrived at the hospital, where we were met by Dr. Arturo Marchand, the cardiologist who would perform the procedure. He asked Bernie a standard series of questions. "Senator, are you allergic to eggs?" "Ari, you answer these questions." "Senator, I have no idea if you're allergic to eggs." "No, I'm not allergic to eggs." "Senator, who here can make medical decisions for you in the case you are incapacitated and we can't reach your wife?" "Ari." It was the obvious answer, given that of the campaign staff at the hospital, I was both the highest-ranking staffer and personally the one closest to him. But it still shocked me. "Senator, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain are you in?" "That is a bullshit question. I have no idea." The doctor looked at him, perplexed, but moved on. Bernie was wheeled into the catheterization room, and Jesse and I walked to a waiting area along with Charla Bailey, the staffer who had scouted the hospital arrival. I made another round of calls. Jane was booking a 6 a.m. flight from Burlington, Vermont, through Chicago, which would get her to Vegas by midday. Faiz would be on an a.m. flight from D.C. "This campaign is over," I told Jesse and Charla. "We work for a 78-year-old who is running for president. There is no way our campaign survives this. But we have to run through the bag," I said, using a Little League analogy. "We owe it to Bernie to do our jobs perfectly over the next few days." They nodded in agreement. About 45 minutes later, Dr. Marchand came into the waiting room. The blockage was only in one artery, and the procedure to clear it had been a success, he said. I put the doctor on the phone with Jane. Charlotte, Jessie, and I soon found ourselves in Bernie's room. He looked at Charlotte and joked, "Why am I in the hospital every time we are together?" Charlotte had been in South Carolina back in March, when he banged his head on a shower door, an injury requiring 7 stitches. We all laughed, and I knew then he would be okay. I noticed that the color had returned to his face. It was a subtle change from the previous weeks. I hadn't paid attention. But now, in hindsight, I realized Bernie's complexion had grown progressively grayer, and he'd begun to look older than usual. Already, a healthy pink hue was returning. I was relieved. But I still didn't think the campaign would survive. The next afternoon, with Jane, Faiz, and me sitting in his hospital room, and Jeff on the phone, Bernie made his opinion known. "Look, there's no point in quitting now. If people aren't going to vote for me, that's fine. But we need to keep talking about the issues that matter. Without this campaign, that won't happen." Bernie's campaign was always about more than just winning the White House. It was about creating a political environment conducive to the agenda he had devoted his life to, making health care a human right, reversing the impacts of climate change, and making higher education available to every American by ensuring that public colleges and universities were tuition-free. For someone who has mastered many aspects of modern politics in the United States, Bernie is at best ambivalent about, in truth hostile to, our current political discourse. He detests the focus on personality and process. His relentless focus on his core agenda blinds him to the desire of most people to truly know him, in the way they hope to know the politicians they elect to high office. To Bernie, that's all gossip. Issues are what matter, not personalities. That's why, even after 2 presidential campaigns, the public, his supporters, and many on his staff don't really know who Bernie Sanders is. While his agenda has caused a tectonic shift in our politics, such that even a moderate like Joe Biden, as president, has overseen the largest non-military expansion of the federal government since the New Deal, Bernie had waged a lonely fight for his central policies for years. In many ways, his distance from the mainstream was a comfortable place for him. He would lament often on the campaign trail that, prior to 2015, he didn't have to watch what he said, because often nobody cared. He would joke about a press conference he once held on Capitol Hill with AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka that was not attended by a single reporter from a mainstream outlet. Having brought the Democratic Party to him without compromising his principles, he will never be lonely again. Yet, despite his influence and fame, he has remained the same person he was before. What was clear to all who witnessed it was that his heart attack was insignificant to him, compared to what our campaign meant to the working people of this country. We would press on, because for Bernie, there was no other choice. Bernie Sanders never sought fame or power for their own sake. In many ways, he is shocked by what has happened to him. "Ari, my parents would tell me I was crazy if I told them I would become a senator, much less could become president of the United States," he has said to me on a few occasions. The difficulty in describing what Bernie is like in private is that, at first glance, he is not that much different from Bernie in public. Except for the 4-letter words, specifically fuck, articulated in a drawn-out way in his Brooklyn accent, his head leaning back on his shoulders as the syllables drag out of his mouth. Fuck. In public, Bernie is almost always prim, with the noted exceptions of the word damn, most famously punctuating sentences at debates. "I wrote the damn bill. The American people are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails." In 2018, as New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's primary campaign against the actress Cynthia Nixon heated up, the Daily News quoted one of the governor's spokespeople saying that he was in lockstep with Bernie Sanders on policy. This boast was laughable on its face, so I tweeted, "The idea that Andrew Cuomo and Bernie Sanders are lockstep on policy is 100% grade A American bullshit." Cuomo was incensed by the tweet, and personally called multiple senior staff members in Bernie's office to demand that I be reprimanded or even fired. Bernie was on a plane from Burlington to D.C. as this was taking place. I went to the airport to intercept him before Cuomo could get a hold of him. Bernie got in the car and asked me what was going on. I explained what I had tweeted. Bernie started laughing. Then he stopped. "Ari, you represent me when you tweet. You should not have used the word bullshit. A better tweet would have said that if Bernie Sanders and Andrew Cuomo were in lockstep, then he would support Medicare for all." Cursing might be the only area where Bernie's private words diverge from his public ones. Bernie truly believes every word that leaves his lips. And the times when we, his senior staff, asked him to say something for political reasons, he could barely keep it together, almost always failing. Bernie loves rallies and is not a fan of Washington politics. He is not unpopular within Congress, but rarely socializes with his peers. He is a rabble-rouser and a street protester, but also someone who respects authority and rarely bucks party leadership. He loves media attention but has his limits. The attention has to serve his larger policy interests, or it's not worth it. Or even worse, it's a reality show. One example that stuck in my head came in the lead-up to the government shutdown in 2018. I and a few other staffers came up with a plan for Bernie to lead a sit-in in Mitch McConnell's office. It would have been carried across the news networks, and we likely would have raised millions of dollars in online contributions. Bernie would not even think about it. "Ari, that is a stunt. Go pitch it to another senator," he said. The subtext was clear. Governing is serious, people were in trouble, act like it. But Bernie is not serious all the time. One difference between public Bernie and private Bernie is the joyfulness of the latter. Beyond his family, Bernie gets excited about baseball and football and historical sites and monuments. Often, while on the campaign trail, we would stop just to stroll around landmarks without public notice. With no press or fanfare, we toured the Alamo and visited the Buddy Holly Memorial in Lubbock, Texas. He lamented that following the 2016 campaign, any hope of anonymity was gone forever. Now, wherever he went, from airport terminals to restaurants, people would line up to ask for selfies. Bernie can be seen as humorless, but in fact he has a superb sense of humor, dry and cutting. At the end of a nearly 4-hour drive from Los Angeles to Desert Hot Springs, where he was vacationing at a spa, we passed a massive wind farm with several large windmills. Bernie had been silent for the better part of an hour, his head slumped as he took a nap. As we drove through the wind farm, he looked up and stared at a windmill. "That, Ari, is a giant motherfucking windmill." I could not stop laughing for the rest of the ride. To the world at large, he is Bernie or Bernie Sanders, never just Sanders. In memos he might be referred to as SBS, but to senior staff on the campaign, he was also Earl. As in, Earl is dead wrong about this. Earl was really funny this morning. Earl refuses to do debate prep. It's what we call Bernie in public, in taxis and restaurants, on planes, and even walking down the street, especially in Washington, D.C. and Burlington, Vermont, where saying his first name out loud would cause more than a few ears to perk up. I have no idea how or when senior staff started using Earl as a code name for Bernie, but it stuck. Earl was also the name of the encrypted signal thread that senior staff used to communicate with each other. Talk to any senior staffer in public, and Bernie could do no wrong. Earl, however, elicited a more forthright critique. Earl wasn't mean or abusive, and his dry humor would crack us up. But the truth was that Earl's superpowers were also his weaknesses. Most glaringly, that he hated the political part of political campaigns. His 2016 campaign never hired a political director. The person primarily responsible for maintaining relationships with politicians and organizations for the candidate. In 2020, our political department was run by Ana Lilia Mejia, who had spent her career in New Jersey union politics, and Sarah Badawi, who had spent years working for major progressive organizations. Because of Earl, Ana Lilia and Sarah had the toughest jobs on the campaign. They needed him to call important people, elected officials, union leaders, heads of progressive organizations. But Earl hated those calls. The idea that these people would need to be courted and have their asses kissed was at best an annoyance, and at worst, exactly the kind of glad-handing he detested. Getting him to make these phone calls was a thankless task. And if he did make a phone call, and it didn't immediately result in an endorsement, he would point to it as an example of our wasting his time. "Ari, I'm busy," he'd say. "I can't spend my life on the phone with everyone." On the positive side, Bernie's reluctance to engage in this form of politics meant he could be a candidate who did not care about the traditional mores of the Democratic Party, because he never built bridges that he could burn. This allowed him to challenge the traditional power structures and take positions others might deem too radical. There were other challenges we faced. Earl hated spending money on staff. Early in the campaign, he had walked into headquarters and seen about 100 new faces. He lost it. Why did we have so many employees? What were they doing all day? He insisted on a hiring freeze that substantially damaged the campaign. And perhaps his biggest mistake, he demanded we send the campaign's policy director back to the Senate, hamstringing the campaign just as Elizabeth Warren climbed in the polls, and the strength of her "has a plan for that" slogan. Our campaign, unlike Warren's, had no staff to produce policy plans that could be central to driving a media narrative. Earl hated the process of scheduling. At times, he would insist on approving every second of his day. At other times, he wouldn't engage in the conversation at all, leaving us hanging, sometimes for weeks on end, unable to plan future movements, and often leaving me to go insane with frustration. When Earl did get involved, it often resulted in last-minute changes because he didn't fully trust his staff. Scheduling on a presidential campaign is driven by two elements. First, there are the events the candidate needs to attend: debates, forums, party dinners, and the like. Then there are the states, cities, and communities that need to be visited for strategic reasons. Once a general map is set, say we decided to be in New Hampshire for a 3-day visit, the state director and local staff create a schedule that included rallies, town halls, breakfasts, forums, interviews, and other events based on the needs of the campaign. On the campaign's first trip to New Hampshire, the then state director had sent me a perfectly reasonable schedule that included a mix of media interviews and rallies. Earl, however, wouldn't approve it. When I finally got him to talk about it, he pulled out a map of the state and questioned each stop on the tour, moving some rallies just one town over. This micromanagement could focus on the minutest issues. At the start of the campaign, Bernie was concerned about the quality of our bumper stickers. He stuck one to his desk and then peeled it up easily to demonstrate his dissatisfaction. It lacked a firm hold on surfaces and would fall off people's cars. He immediately got on the phone with senior advisor Chuck Rocha and demanded higher quality stickers. There was the time he spent 3 hours on the phone with me and our director of advance, Jean-Michel Picher, who had produced some of the most memorable political rallies of the past decade, discussing the merits and costs of purchasing sound systems versus renting them. He had a similar conversation with Ben Cohen, the co-founder of Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream and a co-chair of the campaign. It's not that we didn't arrive at the right answers. It was just that Earl would waste time on these little decisions, overriding the expertise of staff who had been working on such matters for years. On campaigns, you can always raise more money or hire more staff. A candidate's time is the only non-renewable resource. On a presidential campaign, advance are the staff who set up the rallies, plot the motorcade routes, make sure the press are properly set up and corralled at events, check the candidate and traveling staff into the hotel, and generally make sure that the campaign is safe and efficient while traveling. Responsibilities can extend to finding a hospital on short notice. Yet Earl consistently pushed to minimize their presence. In part, this was because he hated entourages. They simply made him uncomfortable. But he also believed that in 2016, the campaign had overspent on events. To Bernie, campaigning meant getting in a car with Jeff Weaver or Phil Fioramonti and driving around Vermont, holding town halls that could be scheduled a day in advance. He never fully appreciated the effort it took to set up a 5,000-person rally. As far as principles go, Earl had a fairly modest set of requirements. The number one rule was no giant suites. He hated it when hotels would upgrade him to their biggest suite. This was not, as one might expect, a matter of principle for a left-wing politician. Earl simply liked to sleep in rooms that were cold, and large hotel suites did not cool down as well as small single rooms. In fact, Advance would set the temperature in his room to 60 degrees before he arrived. Earl's other comfort needs were likewise simple. Water in the room, red Gatorade or vitamin water, cough drops. Pre-heart attack, Milano cookies were a favorite. Post-heart attack, clementines became ubiquitous. After he lost his voice in September 2019, a friend recommended a specific and hard-to-find brand of cough drop, Gretter's Blackcurrant Pastilles. For weeks after the campaign ended, advance staff would text each other with pictures of tins and the tiny black candies they found in the crevices of their bags. Other than that, Earl just needed his iPad and he was relatively content. Without Earl's eccentricities, Bernie wouldn't be the leader he is. He never became accustomed to the trappings of power, and he figured out how to succeed in politics without compromising his core values. Unlike many politicians, he was not forced to stop being who he authentically is, which is one reason his supporters and staff love him. My journey into Bernie's orbit was an unexpected one. I didn't work for him during his campaign in 2016. At the time, I was a host at SiriusXM, and my superiors were reasonably serious about maintaining neutrality in the primaries. When I was going to endorse Bernie, just before Super Tuesday, my boss sternly warned me against it, telling me that when Hillary inevitably won the presidency, I could cause Sirius's progressive channel to be blackballed by the new administration. The night Donald Trump was elected President of the United States changed everything for me. I was at the Javits Center in New York, under that giant glass ceiling that was the final overthought gimmick of the 2016 election. My job was to cover the night's proceedings that would ultimately end in Hillary Clinton's election as the 45th President of the United States. Was I excited to see her as president? Not particularly. The defining moment of my political generation was the decision to go to war in Iraq, something she was on the wrong side of. The fact that Joe Biden was too, and had led the effort to pass the war resolution in the Senate, was one reason I remained unenthusiastic about his administration during the 2020 election cycle. That night, my responsibilities included interviewing a lineup of Clinton surrogates, all expressing excitement about the prospect of her presidency. Michelangelo Signorelli, Mark Thompson, and Nomi Konst, my colleagues on SiriusXM Progress, were in studio. As progressive hosts, we were all a bit cocky. Of course, Hillary was going to win. I even went on conservative commentator Tommy Laren's television program early in the evening to boast about defeating Donald Trump. I had my future laid out for me. In the coming weeks, I was going to launch a new think tank to push Hillary's administration to the left, arming progressive allies on Capitol Hill with policy and communications weapons necessary to engage in that fight. Hillary would win, and it would be our job to force her administration to be more progressive. Then it happened. I was interviewing Mary Kay Henry, the president of SEIU, one of the country's largest.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?